The Galactic Council assumed humans were frail, a newly discovered species barely worth a diplomatic footnote. They were wrong. When the orbital station's gravity inhibitors were sabotaged to crush everyone inside, the room fell dead silent. Not because of the attack, but because the human bodyguard just stood up. Ambassador Serafina Croft adjusted the cuffs of her immaculate, silver-threaded diplomatic tunic, staring out the reinforced viewport of her suite. Beyond the glass, the sprawling architecture of the Zenith orbital station gleamed against the backdrop of a vibrant nebula. Serafina was a dignitary of the Irian Concord, a species renowned for their towering, graceful stature, hollow bone structure, and unparalleled intellect. They were artists, philosophers, and the premier peacekeepers of the known galaxy. But for all their elegance, they were physically fragile, requiring heavily controlled environments to thrive. Today, that fragility was a liability. She was preparing to negotiate the territorial rights of the resource-rich Selam sector with the Craxian Empire. Representing the Craxians was General Victor Helmsley. Despite his perfectly tailored, distinctly Western-sounding translated name, Helmsley was a brute. His species had evolved on a dense, rocky world, gifting them with armored dermal plating and a predatory temperament. Helmsley was notorious for his ruthless tactics. Diplomats who opposed him had a strange tendency to suffer fatal accidents. Serafina sighed, the delicate auditory receptors on the sides of her head twitching with anxiety. She turned away from the viewport and surveyed her security detail. 3 elite Irian guards stood at attention, their energy pikes humming softly. And then, standing quietly near the door, was Specialist Thomas Mercer. Thomas was a human. Humanity was a remarkably recent addition to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only a decade prior. To the wider galaxy, humans were an anomaly, but not a particularly impressive one. They lacked the natural armor of the Craxians, the venomous fangs of the Vipers, or the telepathic resonance of the luminaries. They were soft-skinned, endothermic bipeds with a shockingly short lifespan. The Galactic Council had categorized Earth as a Class 3 temperate zone, completely unaware of the planet's true classified status in the clandestine archives of human military intelligence. Serafina had hired Thomas through a private defense contractor, Vanguard Secure Solutions, largely as a token of goodwill toward the newcomer species. He was relatively cheap, and his presence looked good for public relations. He was a compact man by Irian standards, barely reaching Serafina's shoulder, with close-cropped brown hair, neutral features, and eyes that constantly scanned the room with quiet intensity. "Specialist Mercer," Serafina said, her voice carrying the melodic trill native to her people. "Are the transport corridors secured for our transition to the Grand Hall?" Thomas nodded respectfully, stepping forward. "Yes, Ambassador. I've personally swept the primary and secondary routes. Vanguard protocols dictate a staggered approach. My team will take the Vanguard, and your Irian Guard will maintain a close perimeter." Serafina offered a polite, if slightly condescending, smile. "Thank you, Thomas, but please stay behind the heavy shields today. General Helmsley is not known for his restraint, and I would hate for you to be injured should his entourage become aggressive. Your biological structure is delicate." Thomas's expression didn't change, though a faint glimmer of amusement danced in his eyes. "Understood, Ambassador. I'll keep out of the way." As the diplomatic procession made its way through the gleaming, vaulted corridors of Zenith Station, the tension was palpable. The air was thick with the mingled presence of a dozen different alien species, the soft hum of anti-gravity repulsors echoing off the marble-like floors. When they arrived at the Grand Hall, General Victor Helmsley was already there, holding court among his heavily armed retainers. Helmsley stood nearly 8 feet tall, his broad shoulders covered in thick, interlocking plates of natural keratin. He sneered as Serafina approached, his deep, rumbling laughter vibrating through the floor. "Ambassador Croft," Helmsley boomed, offering a mock bow. "I see you brought your flock. And what is this?" He leaned down, his massive reptilian eyes locking onto Thomas Mercer. "A human?" Have the Irians fallen so far into poverty that they must hire the galaxy's softest mammals for protection? The Craxian guards chuckled, a sound like grinding stones. Seraphina stiffened, her posture rigid with practiced diplomatic grace. Specialist Mercer is a valued member of my detail, General Helmsley. I suggest we focus on the Selam sector treaties rather than my staffing choices. Helmsley smirked, revealing rows of jagged, serrated teeth. Of course, Ambassador. But one must wonder how well one can negotiate when they are so utterly defenseless. Thomas said nothing. He simply stood at parade rest, his hands clasped behind his back, his breathing slow and measured. To Seraphina, he looked intimidated, frozen by the overwhelming presence of the Craxian warlord. She felt a pang of guilt for bringing him into this viper's nest. She didn't know that Thomas wasn't frozen in fear. He was calculating the exact amount of kinetic force required to shatter a Craxian cervical vertebra in case the negotiations went south. The summit officially began. For hours, the two factions debated over holographic star charts. Helmsley was aggressive, constantly demanding concessions and leveraging the implicit threat of his empire's military might. Seraphina held her ground, but the psychological toll was immense. She felt the heavy gaze of the Craxian guards on her, their hands resting entirely too close to their plasma sidearms. As the first day of negotiations concluded, a mandatory diplomatic gala was scheduled in the station's observation deck. It was meant to foster camaraderie, but in reality, it was just another battlefield. Seraphina retired to her quarters briefly to change into her formal attire, her mind racing with contingencies. They are pushing us into a corner, Seraphina murmured to herself, staring into the mirror. Thomas, standing guard by the doorway, spoke up. His voice was calm, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the Irian delegation. With respect, Ambassador, General Helmsley is overplaying his hand. He's attempting to force a capitulation through intimidation because he doesn't have the logistical supply lines to hold the Selam sector in a prolonged conflict. It's a bluff. Seraphina paused, turning to look at the human. You understand stellar logistics, specialist? I read the briefing files, Thomas replied simply. And bullies are the same no matter what planet they come from. They rely on the victim backing down before a punch is ever thrown. Seraphina smiled weakly. A comforting thought, Thomas. But if a punch is thrown, my people will shatter. We are not built for violence. That's why you hired me, ma'am, Thomas said, his face completely serious. Seraphina appreciated the sentiment, even if she found it fundamentally absurd. A human protecting a Irian from a Craxian was like a leaf offering to shield a flower from a falling boulder. But she didn't want to insult him. She simply nodded and motioned toward the door. Let us go to the gala. We have a treaty to save. The Zenith Station observation deck was a marvel of galactic engineering. A massive dome of transparent aluminum offering a breathtaking 360-degree view of the cosmos. Chandeliers made of raw, glowing crystal hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, ethereal light over the hundreds of dignitaries, aristocrats, and politicians mingling below. Seraphina drifted through the crowd with practiced elegance, a glass of sparkling Luminina wine in her hand. Her Irian guards formed a loose triangle around her, their ceremonial armor gleaming. Thomas Mercer walked quietly a few paces behind, blending into the shadows, a ghost in a dark suit. Across the room, General Victor Helmsley was holding court, surrounded by a sycophantic crowd of minor diplomats. He caught Seraphina's eye and raised his massive iron goblet in a mocking toast. Seraphina ignored him, turning her attention to a representative from the Deep Core Mining Guild. But Thomas didn't ignore Helmsley. The human's eyes tracked the general, noting the subtle, coordinated movements of the Craxian retainers. They weren't drinking. They weren't socializing. They were moving into tactical positions, securing the exits and isolating the Irian delegation from the main crowd. Thomas tapped the comm unit in his ear. Vanguard 1 to Irian Actual. Be advised, Craxian forces are establishing a perimeter block. I don't like this. Seraphina's lead guard, a tall, proud Irian named Commander Silas, scoffed over the private channel. Calm your nerves, human. This is a secure diplomatic zone. Weapons are strictly prohibited, and the station's internal dampeners prevent energy discharges. You don't need energy weapons to kill someone? Thomas murmured, his eyes locking onto a small metallic device attached to the belt of one of Helmsley's guards. It didn't look like a standard comm unit. It looked like a localized override module. Before Thomas could press the issue, the crystal chandeliers flickered. The soft hum of the station's ambient machinery died, replaced by a sudden, jarring silence. Then the gravity hit. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a targeted, catastrophic manipulation of the room's gravimetric plating. In an instant, the artificial gravity in the observation deck spiked from the standard galactic norm to 400%. The effect was devastating and immediate. The elegant, hollow-boned Irians didn't even have time to scream. The sudden crushing weight drove them to the floor instantly. Seraphina's legs buckled, her delicate bones fracturing under the immense pressure. She collapsed onto the polished marble, gasping for air as her lungs struggled to expand against the crushing weight of her own chest. Around her, the gala turned into a scene of absolute horror. Diplomats from low-gravity worlds were crushed, their fragile bodies breaking under the invisible, oppressive force. Commander Silas and the elite Irian guards fell to their knees, their ceremonial armor suddenly becoming a lethal burden. They dropped their energy pikes, clutching their chests, unable to lift their heads. Through the haze of pain and dimming vision, Seraphina looked up. General Victor Helmsley and his guards were completely unaffected. The Craxians, native to a high-gravity, dense world, merely rolled their shoulders, comfortable in the suddenly oppressive environment. More importantly, they wore specialized gravity-nullifying belts, ensuring they maintained perfect mobility while everyone else was glued to the floor. "Oh dear," Helmsley boomed, his voice echoing through the groaning, panicked hall. He casually set his goblet on a nearby table. "It appears we have experienced a catastrophic station malfunction. How tragic." Helmsley drew a heavy, serrated kinetic blade from beneath his ceremonial robes. The weapon was strictly prohibited, smuggled in precisely for this moment. His guards did the same, drawing jagged swords and heavy kinetic batons. The internal dampeners might prevent laser fire, but they did nothing to stop cold, hard steel. "It seems the negotiations are concluded, Ambassador Croft," Helmsley sneered, slowly walking toward where Seraphina lay paralyzed on the floor. Such a shame the Irian delegation didn't survive the structural failure. Seraphina tried to speak, to beg, but the gravity was too intense. Blood trickled from her nose. She was suffocating, her ribs dangerously close to snapping and puncturing her heart. She looked around desperately. Her guards were incapacitated, slipping into unconsciousness. Helmsley stood over her, raising the massive kinetic blade. "Any last words, Ambassador?" "No? I suppose the gravity is a bit much for your delicate vocal cords." He brought the blade down. It never reached her. A hand shot out from the periphery of Seraphina's vision, wrapping around Helmsley's thick, armored wrist. The impact sounded like a thunderclap. Helmsley gasped, his eyes widening in absolute shock. He tried to force the blade down, but his arm was locked in place, held by a grip that felt like a titanium vice. The general looked down, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. It was the human. Thomas Mercer was standing. He wasn't standing easily. His posture was slightly hunched, his jaw clenched, and sweat beaded on his forehead. The veins in his neck bulged, and his dark suit stretched tight across his shoulders. But he was on his feet, under 4 times standard galactic gravity, an environment that was currently liquefying the internal organs of a dozen alien species. The human was standing. What the Galactic Council did not know, what they had failed to investigate before stamping Earth as a Class 3 temperate zone, was that humanity evolved on a world the rest of the galaxy would classify as a Class 9 Deathworld. Earth's gravity was inherently crushing compared to the galactic standard. Its atmosphere was volatile, its biosphere violently competitive, and its apex predators uniquely savage. To the Irians, 4G was a death sentence. To the Craxians, it was heavy but manageable. To Specialist Thomas Mercer, it was just a high-intensity resistance workout. "You talk too much," Thomas grunted, his voice tight but remarkably steady. Before Helmsley could react, Thomas twisted the general's wrist. There was a sickening crack that echoed through the silent hall. Helmsley roared in agony, dropping the kinetic blade as his armored wrist shattered. Thomas didn't stop. Moving with a speed that defied the oppressive gravity, he stepped into Helmsley's guard, driving an elbow directly into the Craxian's chest plate. The keratin armor, designed to deflect kinetic rounds, spiderwebbed and caved inward. The force of the blow lifted the 8-foot-tall, 500-pound alien off his feet, sending him crashing into a crystal banquet table. The observation deck, filled with the groans of the dying and the terrified, suddenly fell dead silent. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the grand hall was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of Thomas Mercer. He stood over the shattered ruins of the banquet table, slowly rolling his shoulders to adjust to the crushing weight of the room. The artificial gravity pulled at his muscles, demanding that he kneel. But millions of years of primate evolution on a high-gravity rock refused to yield. The Craxian guards, previously wearing grins of sadistic triumph, were completely frozen. Their reptilian eyes darted from the groaning, incapacitated form of General Helmsley to the small, soft-skinned human standing in the center of the room. It was scientifically impossible. The human should have been a puddle of broken bones and ruptured organs. Instead, he had just incapacitated their warlord with a single devastating strike. "Kill him," Helmsley wheezed from the wreckage, spitting thick purple blood onto the floor. "He's just one mammal. Tear him apart." The command broke the stupor. 6 elite Craxian assassins, each a hulking mountain of armored muscle, raised their heavy kinetic batons and serrated blades, converging on Thomas. Serafina watched through half-closed, pain-filled eyes. "Run." Her mind screamed what her vocal cords could not produce. "Run, Thomas. You can't fight them all." Thomas didn't run. He reached down and picked up the heavy kinetic blade Helmsley had dropped. The weapon was designed to be wielded with 2 hands by a Craxian. Thomas hefted it effortlessly in one. The heavy iron felt comforting and balanced in his grip. The first assassin lunged, swinging a massive baton aimed directly at Thomas's skull. Thomas didn't block it. Instead, he ducked beneath the wide telegraph swing. The human's reaction time, honed on a world where predators attacked from the shadows without warning, was something the slow, heavily armored aliens could not comprehend. As Thomas slipped under the guard, he drove the hilt of his borrowed blade upward, smashing it into the underside of the Craxian's jaw. The alien's head snapped back with a brutal crunch, the sheer blunt force trauma scrambling its central nervous system. The behemoth collapsed instantly. 2 more rushed him simultaneously from the flanks. Under standard gravity, their coordinated strike might have boxed him in. But under the 4G suppression field, the aliens were sluggish, relying on their nullifier belts to move normally while totally unprepared for an opponent fighting at the same speed. Thomas spun on his heel, using the heavy gravity to anchor his momentum. He swung the stolen blade in a vicious horizontal arc. The weapon cleaved through the first assassin's armored chest plate like wet paper, tearing through the nullifier. Belt at his waist. The moment the belt was destroyed, the full force of the 4G field hit the wounded alien, slamming him face-first into the marble floor with bone-shattering force. The third assassin hesitated, stepping back in horror. That hesitation was his undoing. Thomas closed the distance in a single explosive stride, driving a straight kick into the alien's knee joint. The leg snapped backward, and as the Craxian fell, Thomas delivered a devastating right hook to its temple. The crack of the impact echoed sharply. 3 down. 3 seconds. The remaining 3 assassins backed away, their weapons trembling in their massive hands. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a primal, instinctive terror. This wasn't a diplomat's pet. This was a predator. "Vanguard Protocol," Thomas said aloud, his voice dropping an octave and carrying a cold, mechanical lethality that chilled the blood of everyone conscious in the room. "Lethal force authorized in defense of the principle." He didn't wait for them to attack again. Thomas surged forward, abandoning the heavy blade and tackling the nearest Craxian. He drove the alien to the ground, pinning its massive arms with his knees. The Craxian thrashed, roaring, but Thomas locked his hands around the alien's thick neck and squeezed. The muscles in the human's arms corded, fueled by adrenaline and the terrifying strength of a Deathworlder. The alien gasped, its eyes bulging before passing out from asphyxiation. The last two assassins threw down their weapons, dropped to their knees, and raised their hands in a universal gesture of surrender. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the monster disguised in a gray suit. Thomas stood up slowly. He brushed a speck of purple blood off his lapel, his chest heaving slightly as he processed the oxygen demands of the high-gravity environment. He walked deliberately toward the control panel on the wall, completely ignoring the surrendered guards. With a swift, heavy punch, he shattered the tempered glass of the security console, reached inside, and ripped out the localized override module that Helmsley's men had installed. Instantly, the artificial gravity snapped back to the standard galactic norm. The sudden release of pressure was met with a chorus of gasps, coughing, and groans from the dozens of incapacitated diplomats scattered across the hall. Commander Silas and the Irian guards greedily sucked in air, their bodies trembling as they tried to recover. Serafina lay on her back, staring up at the vaulted ceiling. The crushing weight was gone, but her mind was still reeling. She slowly turned her head. The grand hall was utterly devastated. Broken glass, shattered tables, and the massive unconscious bodies of the galaxy's most feared warriors littered the floor. And standing in the center of the carnage was Thomas Mercer, calmly adjusting his cuffs. The room fell completely, breathlessly silent. No one moved. The diplomats, the aristocrats, the surviving guards. Every eye was fixed on the human, the species they had mocked, the creature they had dismissed as frail, soft, and irrelevant. General Helmsley stirred in the wreckage, clutching his shattered wrist. He looked up at Thomas, his reptilian eyes wide with absolute terror. What are you? The general choked out, his voice a pathetic rasp. Thomas stepped over the debris, looking down at the broken warlord with cold, impassive eyes. I'm from Earth, Thomas said quietly. We don't do well with bullies. He turned his back on Helmsley and walked over to Serafina. Dropping to one knee, the terrifying aura surrounding him vanished in an instant, replaced by the polite, professional demeanor of a bodyguard checking on his client. Ambassador Croft, Thomas said softly, offering his hand. Are you injured? Medical teams are en route. Serafina looked at his hand, then at his face. For the first time, she truly saw him. Not as a political token, not as a frail mammal, but as the product of a world so violently hostile it had forged its children out of iron and willpower. I am unharmed, Thomas, she whispered, her voice trembling as she took his hand. He pulled her to her feet with gentle, meticulous care, mindful of her fragile bones. She looked around the silent room, watching as the galaxy's elites stared at her human bodyguard in sheer, unadulterated awe. The diplomatic landscape of the cosmos had just shifted forever. Humanity wasn't a footnote. They were the sleeping giants. And Victor Helmsley had just made the catastrophic mistake of waking one up. The immediate aftermath of the observation deck incident was a blur of flashing emergency lights and the frantic, disorganized shouting of Zenith Station's automated medical drones. Irian paramedics hovered over their fallen diplomats, administering bone-knitting stimulants and oxygen synthesizers. In the center of the room, cordoned off by a hastily formed ring of station security officers, sat Thomas Mercer. He had taken a seat on an overturned crate of Luminina wine, casually wrapping a bruised knuckle with a strip of medical tape. He looked entirely out of place, a calm, slightly ruffled human surrounded by the panicked chaos of the galactic elite. Director Alistair Montgomery, the human-sounding yet distinctly avian-featured head of station security, pushed his way through the perimeter. Montgomery's feathers were literally ruffled, his crest standing on end as he looked from the groaning, restrained form of General Victor Helmsley to the quiet human contractor. Specialist Mercer, Montgomery squawked, his voice modulating through his translator collar. "You are aware that striking a foreign dignitary, even a Craxian warlord, is an immediate violation of the Zenith Accords?" Thomas finished tying off the tape on his hand and looked up, his expression deadpan. "Director, with all due respect, the General activated an illegal Class A gravimetric localized suppressor with the explicit intent to assassinate my client and everyone else in this room. Sir Isaac Newton's third law states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Helmsley applied kinetic force to my principle. I applied an equal and opposite reaction to his jaw." Montgomery blinked his large, multifaceted eyes, completely failing to grasp the 17th century Earth physicist reference. But the gravity suppression field was dialed to 400% of the galactic standard. Our atmospheric engineers use that setting to compress diamond composites. You should have been reduced to biological paste. Serafina, now resting in a hovering medical chair with her arm in a temporary stasis cast, glided forward to intervene. Despite her pain, her diplomatic instincts had never been sharper. She had just survived an assassination attempt, and the political leverage she currently held was astronomical. "Director Montgomery," Serafina chimed in, her melodic voice cutting through the noise. "Specialist Mercer acted entirely within Vanguard Secure Solutions' mandate and the Irian Concord self-defense provisions. If you wish to arrest anyone, I suggest you start with the Craxians, who smuggled military-grade weapons and gravity modulators onto a neutral station." Montgomery looked flustered. "I am not looking to arrest anyone, Ambassador. I am trying to understand the physics of what just happened. The Council's records state humanity hails from a Class 3 temperate zone, peaceful, low-impact garden world." Thomas let out a short, dry laugh. "A garden world. Whoever ran your exploratory probes clearly didn't land in the Australian outback, experience a Category 5 hurricane, or try to survive a winter in Siberia." He stood up, towering over the avian security director despite his average human height. "Earth has a standard gravitational pull of 9.8 meters per second squared. The gravity setting Helmsley used to crush your people? That's roughly the G-force our fighter pilots experience just taking a hard turn. Before I joined Vanguard, I served in the United States Army's 75th Ranger Regiment, operating out of Fort Moore. We spent our time carrying 100-pound packs up mountainsides for fun. To us, for G isn't a death sentence. It's just leg day." The silence returned to the immediate vicinity as the aliens strained to process the translation. They didn't know what the 75th Ranger Regiment or Fort Moore was, but the implication was terrifyingly clear. Humanity had hidden its true nature. They weren't a soft new species begging for scraps at the galactic table. They were apex predators from a high-gravity death world, walking among the stars in business suits, pretending to be harmless. Before Montgomery could formulate a response, the station's ambient lighting abruptly shifted from cool blue to a pulsing, urgent red. A mechanized siren began to wail, vibrating through the floorboards. "Warning! Warning! Unauthorized massive energy spike detected in Sector 4. Multiple unregistered vessels decloaking. Threat level, critical." The station's AI voice droned. Montgomery tapped his earpiece, his face turning a pale shade of gray. No, this can't be happening. What is it?" Serafina demanded, pushing her medical chair closer. "The Craxian fleet," Montgomery stammered, pointing a trembling claw toward the massive transparent aluminum viewports. Beyond the reinforced glass, the vibrant colors of the nebula were suddenly blotted out by absolute darkness. Massive, jagged silhouettes materialized from the void, shedding their cloaking fields. They were Craxian warships, brutal, utilitarian wedges of dark metal bristling with plasma batteries. At the center of the formation was a dreadnought, a ship so impossibly large it dwarfed Zenith Station itself. The ambush at the gala hadn't been an isolated incident. It was the spearhead of a coordinated invasion. Helmsley was supposed to eliminate the Irian leadership quietly, paving the way for the fleet to annex the comm sector without political opposition. With Helmsley incapacitated, the fleet was moving to Plan B. Brute force. A holographic projection flickered to life in the center of the observation deck. The image of a scarred, heavily armored Craxian admiral loomed over the room. Zenith Station. The admiral's voice boomed, rattling the remaining crystal chandeliers. You are harboring an illegal combatant who has grievously injured General Helmsley. Furthermore, the Irian delegation has failed to formally surrender the comms sector. You have exactly 10 galactic minutes to power down your defensive grids, hand over the human biological anomaly, and transfer custody of Ambassador Croft. Failure to comply will result in the immediate orbital bombardment of your station. Panic erupted. Diplomats scrambled toward the reinforced emergency bunkers. Montgomery froze, entirely unequipped to handle a full-scale military siege. Serafina looked at Thomas. The human hadn't moved. He was staring at the holographic projection of the Craxian dreadnought. His jaw was set in a hard, uncompromising line. Thomas, Serafina said softly, fear finally cracking her composed facade. You have to run. Get to the escape pods. They don't know the layout of the station yet. If they find you, I don't run from bullies, Ambassador, Thomas interrupted, his voice eerily calm. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a specialized heavy-duty communications device that looked vastly different from standard galactic technology. It was bulky, encased in shock-absorbent rubber, and bore the insignia of a stylized eagle holding a globe. What are you doing? Montgomery shrieked. We have to surrender. They have a dreadnought. We have a protocol, Thomas replied simply, tapping a sequence into the device. For 5 agonizing minutes, the station descended into pandemonium. The Craxian warships charged their primary plasma batteries, painting the observation deck in a menacing, fiery glow. Montgomery begged Serafina to surrender, arguing that the lives of millions on the station were worth more than 1 treaty or 1 human. Serafina, leaning heavily on her unbroken arm, refused. If we yield to terrorists, the Irian Concord falls today. We die standing. Actually, Thomas interjected, checking his data pad. Nobody is dying today. Specialist, you cannot punch a dreadnought. Montgomery yelled, hysterics finally taking over. No, Thomas agreed, but I can call someone who can. 10 minutes have elapsed. The Craxian admiral's voice echoed through the comms. Your defiance is noted. Zenith Station, prepare for. The transmission was violently cut off by a burst of heavy static. Outside the viewport, the fabric of space seemed to tear open. It wasn't the graceful, silent decloaking of the Craxian ships. This was a violent rupture of the dimensional plane, accompanied by a localized electromagnetic pulse that temporarily blinded the station's sensors. When the visual feed stabilized, the room fell silent for the second time that day. Positioned directly between Zenith Station and the Craxian fleet were 3 vessels. They lacked the elegant curves of Irian ships or the jagged, intimidating spikes of the Craxian design. They were brutalist, rectangular slabs of gunmetal gray armor, thick and unyielding. At the forefront was a supercarrier that made the Craxian dreadnought look like a children's toy. Stenciled on the side of the massive hull, in stark white earth English letters, was a name that translated through the station's network. UNS Theodore Roosevelt. Director Montgomery, Thomas said, his voice projecting clearly across the silent room. Vanguard Secure Solutions isn't just a private defense contractor. It's an intelligence apparatus for the United Earth Directorate. We don't send our people into hostile space without overwatch. On the Craxian dreadnought, panic was setting in. The station's internal sensors managed to intercept and broadcast the Craxian tactical scans of the human ships to the observation deck. The data scrolling across the holographic screens was incomprehensible to the aliens. Armor composition: unknown ultrakinetic alloy, impervious to standard plasma. Armament: triple-barreled hypervelocity rail guns. Charge time: 33 minutes, 36 seconds. Energy signature: none detected. Pure kinetic payload. Shielding: none. Defense doctrine: ship relies entirely on physical armor density. Gravitational output: internal dampeners set to 9.8 meters per second squared. Lethal to boarding parties. Admiral. A new voice came over the station's broad-spectrum communications. It was a human voice, older, gruff, carrying a distinct Texan drawl. This is Fleet Admiral Arthur Hayes of the United Earth Navy. You are currently targeting a diplomatic station housing a United Earth citizen and our Irian allies. Lower your weapons, power down your targeting matrices, and execute a tactical withdrawal. You have 1 minute. The Craxian admiral scoffed, projecting his image back into the room. You dare threaten the Craxian Empire? Your ships have no energy shields. Our plasma batteries will melt your hulls to slag. Plasma dissipates against our ablative armor plating, Admiral Hayes replied, entirely unbothered. But our railguns accelerate a 2-ton tungsten slug to a fraction of the speed of light. Energy shields don't stop physics, son. We don't need to melt your ship. We'll just put a hole through it the size of a city block. 50 seconds. The Craxians didn't wait. They fired. A massive volley of superheated plasma erupted from the dreadnought, slamming into the bow of the UNS Theodore Roosevelt. The observers on Zenith Station shielded their eyes from the blinding flash. Montgomery wailed, covering his head. Serafina held her breath. When the light cleared, the human supercarrier remained completely stationary. The plasma had scorched the paint and melted the outermost layer of ablative armor, but the ship itself was entirely unfazed. The brutalist design was meant to take a beating that would atomize a standard galactic vessel. Well, Admiral Hayes sighed over the comms. We tried to be polite. The Roosevelt didn't unleash a barrage of lasers. It simply fired its primary spinal railgun once. There was no sound in the vacuum of space, but the visual impact was apocalyptic. The tungsten slug crossed the distance instantly, tearing through the Craxian dreadnought's energy shields as if they didn't exist. It punched cleanly through the center of the massive warship, exited the rear, and continued into the void. For a second, nothing happened. Then the immense kinetic transfer of energy ripped the dreadnought apart from the inside out. The massive Craxian flagship imploded before detonating in a spectacular, silent fireball, its debris scattering against the shields of its escort ships. The remaining Craxian vessels didn't even attempt to return fire. They immediately engaged their hyperdrives, fleeing into the void and leaving their warlord and their ambitions behind in the wreckage. Back on the observation deck, Director Montgomery had collapsed into a chair, staring at the human ships with a mixture of terror and awe. Serafina Croft let out a long, shuddering breath, a slow smile spreading across her elegant features. Thomas Mercer tapped his earpiece. Good shooting, Admiral. Thanks for the lift. Anytime, Tommy, Hayes replied. Tell the Irians we look forward to stronger diplomatic ties. Thomas turned back to Serafina, who was looking at him with newfound, profound respect. The facade was gone. The galactic community now knew exactly what humanity was. They weren't a weak, soft-fledged species hiding at the edge of the galaxy. They were the apex predators of a death world, possessing a military doctrine forged in the fires of a brutal, high-gravity existence. I believe, Thomas said, adjusting his tie and offering his arm to the ambassador. We have a comm sector treaty to finalize, and I don't think the Craxians will be contesting it anymore. Serafina took his arm, ignoring the lingering pain in her fractured bones. The room parted for them. The galactic elite backed away, their eyes lowered in deference. No one spoke. No one dared challenge them. The room was once again dead silent. But this time it wasn't out of fear of the Craxians. It was out of absolute, terrified respect for the human walking quietly among them. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden might of humanity and the thrilling twists of galactic diplomacy, make sure to hit that like button. Share this story with your fellow sci-fi fans who love a good humanity. Yeah, tale. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more epic stories of Earth's ascendance among the stars. Let us know in the comments which alien species you'd like to see humans face next.